here. So I think the current approach to balancing StarCraft 2, based around first place premier tournament finishes, has brought the game to a breaking point. If this current method of balancing continues, then I don't think it'll be long before several top tier players switch to Protoss full time, and Terrans and Zergs will also be leaving the ladder. Without an active ladder scene, there's going to be no new StarCraft 2 players, and tournament viewership will decline. Some people might think this is okay or inevitable even, simply because of the age of the game. But I'd like people to remember that Brood War exists, and it's doing just fine. So there is an example of a game that's able to pull this off. A very similar game, you might even say. Some decline in players, of course, is expected over time. But if the game is in a healthy place and still attracting new players, then eventually it should reach a point of stability. If the game is in a healthy place, then we should also have an active ladder scene where new players can improve their skills, possibly even reach the level of pro players. Ladder is also how the pro scene gets new viewers. This should be obvious, but we keep ignoring the ladder experience. Using just myself as an example here, I don't watch Fortnite or Dota at all, and I have no interest in watching it. But that's not because I don't think they're good games, it's because I don't play those games. So the idea that StarCraft 2 fans will continue to watch StarCraft 2 tournaments just because they're fans of StarCraft 2 is ridiculous. This is 2025. There are many other things people can choose to do with their time. StarCraft 2 is just lucky that there isn't a comparable RTS to compete with it. If we can't agree that ladder is important, and if nothing is done about this, then I think SC2 has a serious risk of collapsing in the next couple years. We need to agree on the balance priorities for StarCraft 2 moving forward, because the current path of balancing around first place tournament finishes is unsustainable. I'm just an average Joe in the StarCraft 2 scene. I'm not anybody important, but I strongly believe that what I'm saying here is true. I'm gonna back it up with some evidence here, and if at the end you agree, and you have similar feelings, then please like and share, comment, all that stuff. I don't care if you subscribe. I just want to save StarCraft 2. Okay, so if we want to have this discussion, then first we need to establish what exactly is balance. Balance is the impact of a race on players succeeding in games, right? You know, separate from player skill. The main challenge here is measuring balance is trying to separate player skill from the strength of that race. Unfortunately, most people will look at premier tournament representation or finals results as their judge of balance, because this is something that's really easy for people to pick up on. But premier tournament representation is not balance. I cannot be more clear about this. Most tournament formats have the main goal of finding out who's the best player in that tournament. We're not trying to rank everybody on a list, you know? That's more of a round robin, right? Most tournaments, the bracket formats and everything is set up so that we can find out at the end, you know, the winner is the very best player. You know, rankings and placements in the bracket after that have significance, yes, but they're a lot less important than who actually wins the tournament. That's how the bracket formats are set up, right? If you wanted a tournament that shows balance stats, that'd be incredibly hard. You'd have to either do some sort of a round robin where each race has equal representation, or you'd have to do some sort of like a team tournament where each race is a team. But even then, you're still assuming that every player is equal in skill level and that their race is the deciding factor, and that's just not how StarCraft works. So how do we actually measure balance? Unfortunately, there's no perfect way to measure balance. That's kind of the core issue here. One statistic does not trump all others. No data set is perfect, and it's really hard to factor player skill into results. You know, the ideal thing would be if we had like cloning and time machines, you know, that we could see like the same person, right? But then yet they have different experiences and all this stuff. There's just no way to really know for sure, right? However, there are many stats available to look at, get an idea of what balance might be. So we could look at the Aligulac Balance Report. That has, it's basically raw pro win rates at the pro level. It does not take player skill into account. So it's just purely win rates, right? After that, I think, and this is probably the best measure that we have, but it's not perfect, is the Aligulac Performance Report. And that's right under the balance report. It's the second chart underneath. This is basically the same thing, but it takes player skill into account. It uses Aligulac ratings, so it's measuring the difference in performance from what you would expect to see from what we actually saw, based on the player's rating, right? However, players' Aligulac ratings adjust over time. So even if balance never changes, the chart will trend towards showing balanced just because players' ratings will adjust over time. So an unexpected result will become the expected result if over time we continue to see that. Excuse me. After that, we have GM representation. And this is from No Napa. And you could also look at, other league representation as well. But usually people will point to GM representation as an indicator of balance. This, however, is influenced by players with multiple accounts, Also influenced by who's the most active. You have to be active to be in GM. And then because of that, a lot of times people will expand that measure, and they'll look at Masters 1 representation from No Napa as well. And that has like a bit of a larger sample size, and it's less influenced by who's actually active on the ladder right now. But again, it's not perfect, and we're getting a little bit further from the peak of the skill ladder. And depending on your attitude on this, there's different philosophies on where we should cut that off, where we should say, you need to get good, balance is not your problem, right? That's sort of been another one of the core problems with people agreeing on how StarCraft should be balanced. My personal opinion is that, I think that we should take a body of evidence kind of approach, right? But, I think that if we're talking just about this threshold here for where we should cut it off, I think Masters 1 and GM is probably a pretty good place to look at. Okay, after that, we could look at stats from SC2 Pulse. And from that, we have map win rates. And these are just raw win rates, right? But it can show you, how things are looking and, if there's certain maps in the pool that are, very strange and affecting the results, that'll help you understand that, right? We could also look at game length and / duration win rates from SC2 Pulse as well. And that's sort of like, in a TVZ, is the Terran, what chance do they have to win at minute 3 versus minute 4 versus minute 5 example, right? So you can look at all the different matchups like that, and that'll give you a lot more insight into what these things actually look like. For me, for example, like I was struggling really hard in ZVP, and I was feeling like, gosh, either I cheese them in the early game or I hit them with a really hard lurker timing, and if I don't win, then I have no chance. And I thought, oh, maybe that's just me. And then I looked up these stats, and I saw the stats, and I was like, oh, that's not just me. That's everybody's experience in ZVP. So, again, this is not, obviously, it's none of these stats individually is like a nail in the coffin here, right? But, taken together, they can sort of give you a pretty clear picture of how things are looking. There's also many pieces of anecdotal evidence, which, when taken together along with stats, can indicate things about balance. And here is where I would put things like tournaments. We could look at things like tournament results, tournament representation, individual player stats, and also the Aligulac leading / lagging races statistic, which is something people get confused on what that actually means quite a lot, but that's not meant to be an indicator of balance. It's more meant to be like how like a heat meter, I guess, like how things are looking like in the real short term. Again, this is really, such small sample size, all these things. So they're really meant to be taken as anecdotal evidence, if you ask me. And tournament results and representation, that's never meant to be a representation of balance. That tournaments are set up to find out who's the best player in that tournament, not to rank people based on balance. Not the purpose of a tournament. So that's sort of, what I would think is the different measures that we have of balance. I'm sure that there's more that I'm forgetting here, right? But just to give an idea of like how many different stats are available and like what we can really look at here. And also keep in mind, when Blizzard was balancing the game, and I'm talking about when they actually had like a balance and design team and led by David Kim, you know, um, they would look at a lot of different things. They would look at all of this stuff that I'm mentioning, and then also they would play the ladder themselves. They had spreadsheets, they ran simulations, all this stuff. You can find this on Wikipedia. Okay, so next I would have to say that a race not getting good enough first place tournament finishes is not a good enough reason to buff that race. I'll say that again. A race not getting enough first place tournament finishes is not a good enough reason to buff that race. Regardless of who we're talking about here. Although, right now, I think we all know that I'm talking about Protoss, right? StarCraft is supposed to be like real-time space chess. A game that's balanced, and usually the better player should win, but not always. Teases and, unpredictable strategies and things like that. It can happen, right? You can get caught off guard. And that's why we do things like best of 3, best of 5, best of 7, right? But strategy and mechanics should both play a significant role in determining who wins that game, right? So if one race isn't getting first place tournament finishes, that might be the result of balance. But it might also be the result of skill difference between the top players and the players ranked just below them. If we're considering buffing a race because they aren't getting first place tournament finishes, then we need to clearly establish that there is actually a balance issue that justifies buffing that race. The challenge here is agreeing on a definition and measure of balance. And like I was saying earlier, Blizzard used to do this internally using a bunch of stats that aren't available to the public, as well as spreadsheets, simulations, looking at tournament results, and playing the ladder themselves. However, we don't have Blizzard doing that anymore. Now we're kind of left to our own devices. And unfortunately, populism seems to be reigning supreme here, and people are going off of, things that are really easy to put into bite-sized sound bites, like Protoss hasn't won anything. Gosh, that's just like such an attractive sound bite. Real easy to repeat that and not really understand the significance of what you're saying. And, just to make it clear, this isn't like I have a vendetta against Protoss, Actually, for example, thought Protoss was weak at the beginning of Legacy of the Void. But also, I just have to say we've done this with Terran and Zerg already, and the results were not good. So why can't we learn from our mistakes as a community? Some small examples here. So Bjorn's biocontrol was insane. So what did we do? We buffed Queen range, ruining a bunch of interactions and frustrating many Terran and Protoss players for years. I'm talking about... I remember specifically some games, I think it was on King Sejong Station, where Bjorn was body blocking with Marines and then pulling his medevac back so that the Queens couldn't reach it, right? And I remember Zombie Grub pointing this out. And not long after that, we had the Queen range buff. And that, I think also there was like the Spore Burrow time and things like that, like Liberators and Warp Prisms were also kind of significant at the time, but those weren't really, I don't think, the reason why they buffed Queens, because we were all just opening with 3 or 4 Ravagers every game at the time. Like, that's what every Zerg was doing. And it wasn't really that hard to deal with Prisms or Liberators, Ravagers. It was the medevacs that were the problem. So, anyway, getting a little off track here. So, an example for Zerg, Serral's macro was insane. So what did we do? We nerfed creep 1,000,000 times, making Zerg much more frustrating to play. If you don't know, the rhythm of Zerg used to have this really beautiful rhythm where you'd inject, all your larvae would pop, you'd inject, spend all your larvae, and then after that you have a little bit of time to do some micro, you spread some creep. After that you have a few more natural larvae popping, and then you spend those on overlords, and then the cycle repeats itself. Unfortunately, now creep doesn't spread as fast as it used to, So, I mean, you can try to spread creep that way, but it's going to look pretty funky. I think Raynor actually plays like that still. But a lot of other Zergs have switched to, I think it was called the Scarlet method at first, where you kind of alternate which side you're spreading creep on. It's just very frustrating to have to deal with that, because it just totally ruins the rhythm. Anyway, so with that out of the way, what does balance currently look like? Excuse me. So for that, I pulled up some stats last night from the sources that we were listing earlier, and I'll go through them here. So first we have the Aligulac Balance Report. PVZ. PVZ at the pro level is 63.37% in favor of Protoss, meaning Protoss wins like 2 out of 3 games. Almost. Terran versus Zerg, 61.40%. Terran's winning like 6 out of 10 games. PVT, 54.55%. So Protoss is winning a bit more games. Honestly, that stat is kind of surprising given what we've been seeing from PVT. But I think PVT has just been getting a lot more attention. PVZ and TVZ. After that, we've got the Aligulac Performance Report. And remember, this is the one that takes player skill into account. So we see Protoss is overperforming by 104 points, which is insane. After that, we see Terran underperforming by 50 points. And Zerg underperforming by 113 points. My God. After that, we have GM representation. Protoss, they are sitting at a nice 41.8% of GM. Terran, they're sitting at 27.97% of GM. And Zerg, a paltry 25.78% of GM. After that, we're going to look at map win rates. For that, I have to pause this for a moment. I can show you all the picture. Oh my gosh, it's a wall of text. That's scary. Okay. Map win rates. You can see these right here. I could just pull these up on no Napa, but then I'd have to type in all the things. This was just copied from like literally last night, so these stats are current. So we can see here, TVZ, honestly, it's not that bad. We've got favorite Terran maps here, right? PVT, though, holy shit. Every single map favors Protoss. That's ridiculous. ZVP. You can see this is a bit more mixed. This is a bit more real. After that, we could also look at game length and duration win rates, like we were talking about earlier. We can see this here, and apologies if I can make it bigger. Here we go. Win rate distribution by game duration. You can see TVZ here, right? Terran has better chances in this phase of the game. Once it gets past this point, Terran's chances go down quite significantly. Protoss versus Terran. You can see here, Protoss has a lot of wins in the early game here. The first 2 minutes. Goes down here, and Terran, this is kind of equal right here. This is 50% line right here. Then after that, like, whoa. Protoss super favored. Protoss is just favored for the whole matchup, right? ZVP. Zerg has a little bit of early game stuff that we can do. These are like Ling and Roach cheeses in the early game, right? After that, Protoss has some timings, right? Prism timings, Adept timings, all that fun stuff. After that, Zerg has some decent, Hydra Bane and Lurker timings, right? Some chances to win here. Maybe a 3-base Roach Ravager all in, whatever, right? But then after that, it's like good fucking luck. You're playing Zerg, you're kind of screwed. Apparently, in the super late game, some stuff happens here. I'm not sure what this is all about. Maybe this like boss play kind of game, because this is when the map starts to mine out. That's kind of interesting. But yeah, other than that, I mean, good luck. Like, if you don't win with the lurker timing, leave. Okay. So how did balance get to this current state? Okay, so for this, I have to give a little bit of background. A lot of you diehard StarCraft fans probably know this, but some of the more casual viewers maybe don't, or maybe don't realize this, or maybe forgot about this. So we're just gonna go over this stuff again. So, uh, gosh, I mean, I didn't write notes on this, but maybe I should briefly just talk about region lock and things like that. So for many, many decades, or years, I guess, decade and a half or whatever, we had, but also if you consider StarCraft 1, Koreans were by far the best StarCraft players, to the point where if you weren't a Korean in the StarCraft scene, you were referred to as a foreigner, right? And this was because, in large part, Korea had KESPA. If you don't know what KESPA is, like KESPA is the Korean Esports Association. And they had team houses, and they would recruit very young players and have them move into the team house, so they would have full-time coaches and be surrounded by other pro players and just really dive into the life of being a StarCraft pro, right? And they would force them to practice things that they didn't want to play, force them to do things that, they would never have done otherwise, right? But that elevated their skill level to an insane degree to the point where, nobody else could compete, right? They just dominated the scene to the point where, they would fly out their lower tier players to European and NA tournaments to go farm those tournaments because the EU and NA players had no chance, and this was how things were for forever, right? Legacy of the Void came out, and Blizzard decided that they were going to try to do something about this, so they created something called Region Lock with the WCS circuit. Excuse me. And so the way they did this, they basically divided the scene into two regions. So we had like the Korean region and then the rest of the world, basically. And then we had a bunch of tournaments that the rest of the world could compete in, and or the rest of the world could compete in, but Koreans were not allowed to compete there and also compete in the Korean circuit, right? However, if you were a foreigner and you wanted to compete in GSL and then also compete in WCS, I think you could do that, which was a very strange exception. Anyway, getting past the point here a little bit. KESPA and all this stuff is really why Koreans had so much dominance here. KESPA closed its doors for StarCraft 2 teams in 2016, 2017, I want to say. And shortly after that, we had Serral and then Clem after that and Raynor rise to dominance there. And that's sort of where we got this idea that, anybody can be good at StarCraft. It doesn't matter where you're from, right? But just to be clear, like, the skill level of the Korean scene has been declining ever since KESPA closed their doors, and, Clem and Raynor and Serral are still exceptions to the rule. In general, if you compare a lot of these top pro Koreans, they're still way better than most of the EU and NA players. Only reason I'm bringing this up is because Korean military service has a huge impact when you consider how important Koreans are to the StarCraft 2 scene, especially at the time that this was happening. So, a lot of Korean pros, they often had their careers interrupted or cut short by their mandatory 2 years of military service. This has been the reason for many top players retiring forever, including Innovation and TY, for example. They'll file for delays to push this back as far as they can, but eventually they have to do their military service, which is usually a minimum of 2 years away from the game, while all of their competitors are still practicing every day. That means they fall behind, and that's why a lot of them retire or don't get back into the game after they come back from military service, or they really struggle to get back into the game after military service. Why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because in 2019 to 2022, Protoss suffered a great loss of all of their top players having military service at roughly the same time during this 2019 to 2022 period. All of the top Protoss players had military service. And I'm not exaggerating here. The following Protoss players were all affected by this: Stats, Classic, Zest, Hero, SOS, Trap, Parting. And the fact that Parting is even on that list should show you how bad this is, because that's how far down it goes. I could even go further than that. There were more pros affected by this. In a game that treats balance as separate from first place finishes, you would expect Protoss to stop winning tournaments after losing the top 7 Protoss players. I think that's not a crazy thing to say. Keep in mind, the size of the pro scene is not that large, and it has been shrinking pretty dramatically as well. You know, we lost SSL and Pro League in Korea to really big Korean StarCraft 2 tournaments, and a lot of other StarCraft 2 teams after Kespa, like, they all just dropped their players and everything. We used to have, what, like SKT1, Jin Air Green Wings used to have tons of players. They almost brought StarCraft back. They just picked up everybody. You know. Anyway, point is, StarCraft 2 scene, not that big. The losing top 7 players of one race, that's huge. And there were not similar, you know, there were a lot of other players retiring from Terran and Zerg, of course, right? But nowhere near this level, like not the top 7. You know, we had a few of them retiring, yes, but not all of them like this. And we also had Cyril and Clem and Raynor rising to dominance at the same time, right? You have to keep in mind what impact this would have on the stats. So what's interesting is, instead of just the community being like, okay, we would expect Protoss to be losing games after this, instead we saw people complaining and saying that Protoss needed to get buffs. And that's what happened. We saw an endless flood of Protoss buffs to try to compensate for all of these players leaving. And Trap, who was probably the last of these players to leave, benefited from a lot of these changes before leaving for military service, when previously he was considered like a B or C tier player. Like, no offense, it's just the truth. With no casters or streamers drawing attention to this dynamic, the narrative just became that Protoss players all quit because they couldn't win games, and that Protoss is just still not strong enough. And so Protoss buffs continued, year after year after year. So now we're at a point where, you know, we have like top players switching to Protoss. But what should we do about this? What should be done at this point now? I think Blizzard needs to communicate clearly about a change in balance and philosophy. We need to stop balancing around the first place tournament finishes for premier tournaments. And we need to communicate that very clearly from Blizzard. That's not how we're going to be balancing the game anymore. We need to actually look at the pro scene overall and like high level StarCraft overall and see how the balance looks there overall. Not looking at like laser focused at the top 3 players at the top of the ladder. That's insane. And yeah, you know, this is going to mean that Protoss is probably not going to win anything for a while. And Protoss fans will be upset. But you know, that's not the end of the world. Because I'll let you in on a little secret here. Zerg and Terran fans have been upset for years now, and StarCraft 2 is still here. If anything, we should be portraying this as a strength for the game and a sign that its balance is taken seriously. If Protoss is really struggling at the pro level after that, then we need to be patient until Protoss players either improve or are replaced by new players. Or if we could really show that, let's say, you know, if you want to make the skill ceiling argument, if you can really show that the skill ceiling for Protoss is not high enough, then we could address that, right? But then we need to have like a serious deep dive discussion about that, not just be saying, oh, look, Protoss isn't winning first place tournament results. Like, that's ridiculous. So how would I fix this? I know, you know, again, I'm nobody here. I'm just some jackass. But how would I fix this? You know, I don't want to be dumping all these problems here and then just say like there's no way to fix this and let everybody wonder, you know, blah blah blah. So how would I fix this? Honestly, I think this isn't really rocket science. I think that you know, a few broad things that we could do, you know, we could probably fix most of this stuff. Not even that hard. I think the first thing that we should do is just nerfing Protoss economy. The eco is just way too goddamn strong, especially when you consider how strong their aggressive options are, how strong their late game is, and how strong their defense is. I think if we just removed the 50 starting energy from the Nexus, change Chrono back to a continuous Chrono, so it requires a little bit more skill, and we remove energy overcharge, I think that's a good start. You know, if things still are insane after that, you know, we can talk about it then, but I think that's a good start. For Zerg, because keep in mind those stats for TVZ as well. You know, Zerg, I think, just needs some aggressive options back. This also relates to Zerg just being incredibly unfun to play, which is not, you know, a new opinion of mine. Like, a lot of people are saying that, including pros like Raynor. So I think an easy way to buff Zerg aggressive options, just 3 things. Evo Chamber unlocks Overlord drops again. Buff the Nidus slightly. Don't make it broken. Don't make it broken again. Don't make it broken, guys. Resist the urge to make the Nidus broken, but it does need a small buff. And partially revert Ravager build time nerf. Revert it all the way, only if it's necessary. I will freely admit that I think the Ravager build time thing was like a little bit, tiny bit too strong. But we nerfed it way too hard. And for Terran, don't screw up Terran. Terran is incredibly well designed and balanced right now. If anything, I'd say maybe Thors are a little bit too strong versus Broodlords, but you could also like just revert all the Legacy of the Void Broodlord changes to fix that instead of nerfing the Thor. As far as ghosts are concerned, like if there's still an issue for TVZ, then we should be looking at Snipe refunding 100% of energy, not messing with its supply or unit tags or shit like that. Like, although I think that, you know, that's like good things to be looking at for if you want to make the design clear and like clean and consistent, right? It's not really a good way to balance the ghost, you know, because the problem with the ghost in TVZ is not like its supply or like what unit tag it has, it's the snipe is way too goddamn strong. That's what's causing it to be strong in TVZ, so that's what we should probably be fixing if it still needs fixing, right? But that's it, you know. And Terran, honestly, is probably the best designed and, you know, in the best place as a race is concerned right now. Like, not saying Terran is the strongest, but I think that Terran is probably, like, the most well-rounded, and, you know, there's not really any units you can point to. Like, this unit needs attention, you know. Terran is in a pretty good spot right now. I especially love how we're getting the Cyclone, like, better and better versions of it. That, like, I don't know, I feel like we're just getting closer and closer to, like, the perfect version of the Cyclone. This is probably my favorite version of the Cyclone so far, because it kind of, like, it lives up to the original dream of the launch version of the Cyclone, but it's not busted like the launch version of the Cyclone. So, I think it's pretty good where we're at right now. Anyway, these are my thoughts on this. I appreciate you getting this far. You listen this far. And if you feel similarly, you agree with this stuff, please give this a like and a share and a comment and all that good stuff. Because I seriously think that if we don't do something here, like very soon, StarCraft is going to be collapsing on itself. I think the pro scene and ladder is going to collapse on itself probably in the next couple of years if we don't do it. Everybody's just going to be switching to Protoss, and this game is just going to become like a complete laughing stock to all of its fans. That is just not a place that you want to be, especially with the fan base that StarCraft has, because we're not exactly the most forgiving folks. Yeah, anyway, these are my thoughts. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Hope you all have a good one. See you all next time.